Imagine living an entire year without a single bath. In medieval Europe, this wasn't shocking, it was normal. People believed water could make them sick, so many avoided bathing altogether. Sometimes for years. Hello and welcome. Before you close your eyes and get cozy, make sure to subscribe and like the video, and let me get you to sleep flawlessly. Chapter 1. The Unwashed Centuries. An Introduction. Let us settle into a quiet truth about the medieval world. It was a world that did not share our modern obsession with cleanliness. Our journey begins not with kings and battles, but with a simple sensory fact. The air was different. It carried a richer, deeper tapestry of smells. The medieval relationship with bathing was not a casual neglect. It was a conscious philosophy, rooted in a deep and practical fear. The guiding principle was humoral theory. The body was seen as a delicate balance of four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was equilibrium. The skin was considered a porous membrane. Hot water, it was believed, dangerously opened the pores. It would weaken the body's vital spirit, allowing it to escape. More terrifyingly, it would grant entry to miasmas, the invisible foul vapors thought to rise from swamps and rot, the very carriers of disease. To bathe, therefore, was to deliberately make oneself vulnerable. It was an invitation for sickness to enter. This medical logic was often echoed by religious thought. While cleanliness for the soul was paramount, an excessive focus on the physical body could be viewed as vanity. The flesh was corruptible, a source of temptation. For some, neglecting its comfort was a form of piety, a way to master earthly desires. The grime of the world could be a testament to one's focus on the spiritual realm. Thus, the Roman practice of frequent bathing faded into a distant memory. Public bathhouses, known as stews, existed but were viewed with suspicion, often seen as places of vice rather than health. For most people, a full immersion bath was a rare annual event if it happened at all. Imagine, then, the background scent of life. It was not mere dirt, but a constant, quiet blend. The smoke from the central hearth, woven permanently into wool and hair. The greasy smell of tallow candles. The natural scent of the body, layered over time into linen. Chapter 2. The Philosophy of Filth. Why water was feared. So, if the body was not washed with water, how was it cared for? This brings us to the quiet, practical logic of the age. Cleanliness was not abandoned. It was simply redefined. The goal was not to strip the skin bare, but to maintain its proper, closed state. The focus shifted from immersion to a gentle, surface-level maintenance that respected the body's perceived vulnerabilities. The primary method was dry grooming. This was a meticulous, daily practice, especially for those who could afford the time. It involved brushing the hair and beard, if one was permitted to wear one, with combs of wood or bone. This action was believed to stimulate the body, to distribute its natural oils, and to remove the larger, visible impurities without ever risking the dangerous opening of the pores. Lice and nits were a constant, unwelcome companion, and the comb was the first line of defense in a never-ending quiet campaign. The body was also rubbed down with dry linen cloths. This friction was thought to polish the skin, to buff away the top layer of grime and dead skin, and to encourage a healthy closure of the pores. It was a form of polishing the human vessel, rather than rinsing it out. For those seeking a more thorough feeling of refreshment, there was the practice of changing the linen. This is a subtle but crucial point. While the heavy outer layers of wool might be worn for weeks or even months, the thin linen undergarment, the chemise for women, the breechcloth and shirt for men, was changed with relative frequency. This linen was believed to act as a wick. It would draw the sweat and the body's impurities away from the skin itself. By changing this inner layer, one was effectively removing the collected humors and dirt, leaving the body feeling clean without ever subjecting it to the peril of water. The outer garments, often richly embroidered and expensive, were simply aired out, brushed, and sometimes treated. Chapter 3. Layered Linen. The Strange Logic of Cleanliness. We have established the fear of water, and the dry, careful grooming that took its place. But there was another, more intimate layer to this system. It resided in the very clothing worn against the skin. The medieval concept of cleanliness found one of its most sophisticated expressions not in soap, but in cloth. The secret was linen. To understand this is to understand a quiet, domestic logic that governed daily life for both lord and peasant. A logic that seems counterintuitive to us now, but made perfect sense in its time. The outer garments, the heavy woolen tunics, gowns, and hose, were substantial investments. They were dyed, fulled, and tailored. They were not washed, at least not in any way we would recognize. To subject them to water would ruin their shape, fade their colors, and risk shrinking the costly wool. Instead, they were maintained. They were brushed meticulously with wooden bristle brushes to remove surface dirt. They were aired out for days in the fresh, if smoky, breeze. Stains might be carefully scraped away. Sweet-smelling herbs like lavender, mint, or cosmere were tucked into folds or stored in chests with the garments. A practice called strewing, to impart a fresh, grassy scent. The goal was to preserve the garment, not its absolute purity. The true hygiene happened beneath. Next to the skin, almost everyone wore a layer of simple, undyed linen. For women, this was the chemise or smock. For men, a linen shirt and underbreeches. This linen was the workhorse of personal cleanliness. It was cheap, easy to produce at home, and, crucially, it was washable. The theory was elegant. This fine, absorbent cloth acted as a protective barrier. It would wick away the body's sweat and oils, its humoral excess, trapping the dirt and grime upon itself. The linen garment took the brunt of the body's natural processes, shielding the expensive, delicate outer wool from soiling. One was, in effect, Chapter 4, the slow turn of the village year. Let us now move our attention outward, from the private realm of the body to the wider, slow-moving world. We find ourselves in a village, not a specific one, but a pattern repeated across the land, a collection of perhaps 20 or 30 families living in cottages huddled along a single, muddy track. The dominant sound here is not of people, but of silence, punctuated by the lowing of an ox, the distant cry of a crow, the rustle of the wind through the barley. Life here is not marked by dates on a calendar, but by the immense, unchanging wheel of the agricultural year. This wheel turns with a ponderous, inevitable rhythm, dictating every action, every worry, every moment of rest. The year begins, in a practical sense, not in January, but in the autumn with the harvest. This is the climax, the time of greatest urgency and exhaustion. Every able hand is in the fields, men and women and children, swinging sickles under the late summer sun, gathering the grain that must mean survival. The air is thick with chaff and purpose. After the harvest comes the plowing. As the leaves turn, the great oxen are yoked to heavy wooden plows. The men walk behind them, guiding the share through the stubble of the old crop, turning the earth for the winter sowing. The smell is of cold soil and damp wool. The days grow short. The village turns inward. Winter is a time of contraction. The fields lie fallow, frosted and hard. Life retreats to the single room of the cottage, to the circle of firelight. This is the time for indoor tasks, the repair of tools, the weaving of cloth, the telling of stories so old their origins are forgotten. Hunger is a quiet companion. The harvest must last, and the diet narrows to grain porridge, stored root vegetables, and salted meat. The cold is a palpable presence, kept at bay only by the hearth and the shared warmth of family and livestock. It is a long, hushed season of waiting, then a softening. Chapter 6. The sound of the forge at dusk. As the village day wanes, a particular sound carries further on the still air. The rhythmic, metallic tap, tap, tap from the smithy. It is a sound both urgent and timeless. The forge is more than a workshop. It is a point of elemental power within the community, a place where the earthly and the magical quietly meet. The glow of its fire is visible through the open doorway long before the cottage hearths are lit. A small, fierce sun contained within walls of clay and stone. The blacksmith is a figure apart. He is a free man, not bound to the strips of the open field like the villagers. His hands are marked by soot and old burns, his arms knotted with the strength of his trade. He works with the four primal elements: earth in the form of or in coal, air from the great leather bellows, fire in the heart of the hearth, and water in the quenching trough that hisses with dramatic steam. This command grants him a quiet prestige, edged with a faint suspicion. He is a master of transformation, turning shapeless lumps of iron into objects of necessity and beauty. There is a subtle magic in that. His work is the skeleton of daily life. He shoes the great plow horses and the oxen, the slow, patient beasts whose health determines the village's survival. He forges the nails that hold homes together, the hinges for the manor's stout doors, the coulter for the plow that must slice through stubborn soil. He mends the links on the Lord's chainmail, a task done with careful, solemn focus. He fashions the simple knife every man carries at his belt, for eating, for working, for protection. Each strike of his hammer is a conversation with the metal, feeling its resistance give way to his will, shaping its form in the dying light of day. The smithy is also a place of gathering. Men will linger at its edge, drawn by the warmth in winter, sharing the sparse news of the parish. They speak in low tones, the clang of the hammer punctuating tea. Chapter 5. The hum of the manor house. The village does not exist in isolation. Its fields, its rhythm, its very reason for being, are overseen from a place of quiet authority. The manor house. It is not yet the stone castle of storybooks, but often a sturdy, timber-framed hall set within a walled enclosure. It is the administrative heart, the judicial center, and the economic engine of this small world. Its presence is a constant, low hum in the background of village life, felt more often than seen. Several times a year, this hum becomes a direct encounter. The manor court is held. The Lord Steward, a man of immense local power, sits at a trestle table. The villagers, or their representatives, stand before him. The business is mundane, but it is the law. They settle disputes over the straying of a pig, the trampling of a neighbor's strip of barley. They record the inheritance of a cottage, the payment of a heriot, the best beast given to the lord upon a tenant's death. They assign fines for brewing bad ale or for failing to repair a section of the manor's fence. The air in the room is thick with the smell of parchment, ink, and damp wool. It is not a place of dramatic justice, but of quiet, recorded order. The steward's pen scratches, the decisions are made, and life is nudged back onto its proper course. But the manor's claim is also measured in days. The villagers are not free farmers. Most are villains, bound to the land. They owe the Lord labor. These are the work days. Each week, often for 3 days, they must put aside their own strips of land and work on the Lord's domain, his personal farm. They plow his fields, sow his seed, harvest his crops. It is slow, communal work, done with the same tools and the same weary patience as on their own land. You can see them moving in lines across the great field, a quiet, resigned army. Their payment is not coin, but the right to hold their own land, to graze their goose on the common, to live under the Lord's pea. Chapter 8. The forest, larder, pharmacy, and mystery. Beyond the ordered strips of the open fields and the grazing common lies a different world, one that marks the literal edge of the known. The forest. It is not the parkland we imagine today, but a vast, deep, and tangled entity. To the medieval mind, it is not a place of leisure, but a vital, shadowed resource, brimming with both sustenance and peril. Its edge is a powerful boundary, where the human rhythm of the plow meets the ancient, unchecked pulse of wild growth. For the villagers, the forest is first a larder. It provides the pannage, the right to drive their small, hardy pigs into the woods in autumn to fatten on acorns and beech mast. This is a crucial addition to their winter diet. They gather deadfall for fuel, a never-ending task, carrying bundles of faggots back to hearths that are always hungry. They cut specific types of wood for tool handles, for fencing, for the repairs of their cottages. They forage with a deep, inherited knowledge. For mushrooms, for nuts, for berries, for wild greens like sorrel and nettle that break the monotony of bread and pottage. It is also a pharmacy. The wise woman, or anyone with a grandmother's teaching, knows which plants to seek. Willow bark for pain, honey-soaked woundwort for cuts, chamomile for a troubled sleep. These remedies are gathered in season, dried in bunches from the rafters, their scents mingling with the wood smoke. The forest floor is a living apothecary, its secrets passed on in whispers. But this bounty is guarded by fierce law. The forest belongs to the king or the lord. It is a royal forest, subject to its own harsh set of rules, enforced by wardens and verdayers. To take a deer for its meat and hide is not simple theft. It is poaching, a crime against the lord's person, punishable by blinding or hanging. To cut a living oak for timber without license is a serious offense. The forest is a controlled asset, and the common people's access to it is. Chapter 7. The Miller, a Necessary Mistrust. If the blacksmith is viewed with a mix of awe and suspicion, the miller is regarded with a more straightforward, pragmatic distrust. His workplace, the mill, is the second great engine of village life. It stands where the water flows with enough force to turn its great, creaking wheel. A wooden giant groaning and dripping, a captive river god put to work. The sound of it is a constant, low roar, felt in the bones as much as heard, a background vibration to all business done within its flour-dusted walls. The miller's power is economic. He holds a monopoly. By the Lord's decree, all grain from the manor's fields and the villagers' strips must be ground at his mill. It is a soak right, and to grind elsewhere is a finable offense. This enforced custom places him in a position of immense, quiet control. The peasant, after the back-breaking labor of harvest, brings his precious sacks of grain, the substance of his family's winter, to this dusty, noisy cathedral of necessity. Here, in the perpetual, floating haze of flour, the transaction occurs. The miller's fee is not taken in coin, but in kind, a portion of the grain itself. This is the multure, and it is in this measure that the distrust takes root. The mechanisms are hidden, the process obscured by noise and cloud. Is the millstone set perfectly? Is the flow of grain from the hopper true and even? The peasant must wait, watching his hard-won yield vanish into the mill's maw, trusting that what returns as flour is a fair exchange. Proverbs and ballads from the time are unkind to millers, painting them as thieves who fiddle with the scales, whose thumbs are always on the sack, whose profits are literally baked into every loaf. Yet he is also indispensable. Without him, the grain is useless, hard, inedible kernels. He transforms the raw fruit of the earth into the very stuff of life, flour. He is a man of some wealth, his clothes perpetually pale with a fine powder. Euendi. Chapter 9. The Monastic Hours. A life measured in prayer. Far from the village and its forest edge, in a secluded river valley or on a windswept plain, another community keeps time by a different rhythm. The monastery. Its day is not marked by the sun's passage over fields, but by the ancient, sacred cycle of the liturgy of the hours. The canonical hours divide the day and night into a sequence of prayers, a spiritual heartbeat that pulses through the stone cloisters, ordering every moment of monastic life. This rhythm is the true work of the monks, their opus dei, the work of God. It begins in the deep, pre-dawn darkness with matins, the longest and most solemn office. The monks are roused from their sleep in the dormitory. They file silently into the cold, vast space of the church, their breath visible in the air lit only by a few candles. They chant the psalms, their voices a low, steady murmur in the gloom, a sound meant to consecrate the coming day before it has even broken. As the first gray light touches the windows, they gather again for lauds, the office of praise. The tone lifts slightly, greeting the dawn. Then the practical day begins. There is a brief period for study in the cloister or for manual labor in the garden, before prime is sung, dedicating the morning's work to God. The major daytime hours follow, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the mid-afternoon. Each is a short pause, a breaking of the manual or intellectual labor, whether it be copying manuscripts, brewing ale, tending fish ponds, or baking bread, to refocus the mind on the divine. The monks move from their tasks to the choir stalls and back again, their lives a constant pendulum swing between earthly duty and heavenly contemplation. After the main meal, often taken in a refectory where a brother reads aloud from a holy text, there is a period of rest or private reading. Then comes Vespers as the afternoon fades, the most lyrical of the offices. The setting sun slants through. Chapter 10. The scriptorium's quiet scratch of quills. Within the monastery's quiet walls, there exists a room of particular, hushed intensity. The scriptorium. Here, the only sounds are the soft scratch of a quill on parchment, the occasional, careful grinding of ink on a stone slab, and the faint, rhythmic breath of concentration. This is where the world is preserved, not with plow or sword, but with pen and patience. The work done at these sloping wooden desks is considered a form of prayer, a slow, deliberate act of devotion that captures the light of knowledge and faith on the treated skin of animals. The parchment itself is a product of long labor. It comes from the monastery's own flocks, calfskin for the finest volumes, sheepskin for more common texts. The skin is soaked, scraped, stretched, and dried, a process that leaves it smooth and strong. The scribe, his hands clean and cold in the often chilly room, prepares his tools. He trims a goose feather to a precise point. He mixes his inks, black from oak gall, rich red from vermilion or lead, brilliant blue from ground lapis lazuli, a pigment as precious as gold, traveled from distant lands. His work is achingly slow. He copies from an existing manuscript, set upon a stand before him. He does not read for meaning as we do. He copies letter by letter, forming each Carolingian minuscule or Gothic textura with meticulous care. A single mistake, a skipped word, a misshapen letter, requires scraping the error away with a sharp knife, a delicate, risky operation. There is no hurry. Time is not a commodity here, but a medium to be filled with faithful labor. A single Bible could take a year, the life's work of a single scribe. He is not just a copier. In the margins, sometimes a touch of personality, of weariness, will escape. A tiny drawing of a cat chasing a mouse. A note in the margin. The ink is thin. The parchment is hairy. Thank God it will soon be dark. These are the quiet human sighs in the sacre. Chapter 12. The Cathedral. A lifetime's work in stone. While the pilgrim traveled to reach them, most people experienced the divine on a more local scale. In the growing towns, the skyline was dominated by a new and astonishing sight. The cathedral. It was not merely a church. It was an act of collective ambition in stone. A project so vast it would not be completed in the lifetime of the man who first laid its foundation stone. It was a testament to patience, a physical manifestation of a community's faith reaching, quite literally, for heaven. The noise surrounding its creation was immense and constant. The quarrymen's hammers rang out in distant hills, splitting massive blocks. Ox-drawn wagons, their wheels creaking under impossible loads, brought the stone slowly, agonizingly slowly, to the site. There, the master mason, the true architect, directed a small army of craftsmen. The rough-hewers shaped the blocks. The carvers, perched on high scaffolding, gave life to the stone with their chisels. Foliage, grimacing gargoyles, serene saints, all emerging from the gray rock. The sound was a symphony of chipping, grinding, and shouted instruction, dust hanging in the air like a pale mist. The goal was light. This was the great innovation, the Gothic style. Through the genius of the pointed arch and the flying buttress, the solid walls of the older Romanesque churches could be pierced, opened up. Space was no longer a dark, weighty mystery, but a luminous vessel. The walls became skeletal frameworks for vast windows. And into these windows went the stained glass, the Bible of the poor. Craftsmen pieced together hundreds of fragments of colored glass, held by lead cames, depicting saints and stories in radiant hues of ruby, sapphire, and emerald. For the ordinary townsfolk, its construction was the backdrop of their lives. They were born to the sound of its making, married under its unfinished vaults, and would be buried in its shadow long before the last spire wa. Chapter 11. Pilgrimage. The long, dusty road. Not all spiritual journeys were contained within the cloister. There existed another, a slow-moving exodus across the landscape. The pilgrimage. It was a powerful concept, a physical act of penance, devotion, or desperate hope. To take up the staff and scrip, the simple pouch for alms, and walk towards a distant shrine was to step out of the familiar rhythm of one's life and into the vast, uncertain rhythm of the road. The destinations were fixed points in a wandering world. Canterbury, where Thomas Becket's blood sanctified the stones. Compostela in far-off Spain, where the bones of St. James were said to rest. Rome, the heart of Christendom itself. These names were whispered with reverence, goals that could occupy months, even years of a person's life. The pilgrim did not travel for scenery or leisure. The road itself was the penance. The miles wore down the sole of the shoe and the pride of the spirit. The dust of the track coated the cloak. The feet blistered and ached. Yet the pilgrim was not alone. The road created a transient, makeshift community. One might join a group for safety, sharing fires at night, exchanging stories of home and the saints. They were a recognizable sight. The wide-brimmed hat, the cloak, the staff, often adorned with the scallop shell of Compostela or a leaden ampulla, a tiny flask for holy water or oil from the shrine. They moved with a shared purpose, a quiet endurance. The world responded to them in specific ways. By law and custom, pilgrims were to be given safe passage and charity. Monasteries and hospitals, often built a day's walk apart, offered simple hospitium. A bowl of pottage, a place on the straw in a dormitory, sometimes treatment for the road-sore feet. But the road was also fraught with peril. Robbers preyed on the weary, and scrupulous innkeepers charged exorbitant rates. The weather was an unfeeling companion. Every bridge and ford was a potential challenge. And then, Chapter 13, The Itinerant Peddler, News in a Pack. Into the quiet, settled world of the village and the routine of the town came a splash of color and chatter. The itinerant peddler. He was the human thread that stitched isolated communities to a wider, unseen tapestry. His arrival was an event, a break in the monotony. He did not travel the straight, dusty tracks of the pilgrim, but the winding byways and forest paths that linked hamlet to hamlet, appearing as if from another world with his heavy pack and his store of tales. His pack was a marvel of compact wonder. Unbuckled in the manor yard or the village square, it disgorged a treasure trove of small necessities and tiny luxuries. There were practical items. Steel needles, finer than any the local smith could make. Rolls of ribbon and lace from distant Flanders. Packets of exotic spices like pepper or saffron, precious beyond measure, sold in pinches wrapped in scraps of cloth. There might be combs of bone, mirrors of polished steel, small knives, pins, and brass thimbles. For a few extra coins, he might have a bolt of silk, a faded remnant from a noble household, or a painted religious icon on a sliver of wood. But he sold more than goods. He sold information. He was the newspaper, the gossip column, the herald of the outside world. As people fingered his wares, he would share the news gathered on his travels. He spoke of the price of wool in the next shire, of a battle fought in a foreign land, of the health of the king, of a bad harvest over the hills. He repeated songs and ballads from other regions, their melodies strange and new. He told jokes, some bawdy, some sharp with social commentary. He was the connection to everything beyond the parish boundary. He was viewed with a mixture of welcome and wariness. His goods were desired, his stories captivating. But he was an outsider, rootless, bound to no lord or land. He belonged everywhere and nowhere. Could his waits be trusted? Were his stories true? Chapter 15. The Guild Hall, regulating craft and comfort. Within the town's permanent noise, there stood a building of quiet, solid authority. The Guild Hall. It was not a palace or a cathedral, but its influence was woven into the very fabric of urban life. Here, the craftsmen and merchants who shaped the town's economy, the weavers, the bakers, the goldsmiths, the vintners, governed their own worlds. The guild was more than a trade union. It was a social, religious, and regulatory body, a small universe of rules and mutual support that offered a precious commodity in a precarious world, security. To practice a trade within the town walls, one had to be a guild member. The path was long and deliberate. It began as an apprentice, a boy bound to a master for 7 years. He lived in the master's house, learning the craft from the ground up, sweeping floors, running errands, and slowly, painstakingly, acquiring skill. His life was one of obedience and routine. After this, he became a journeyman, free to work for wages from any master, traveling to hone his craft, journeying from town to town. Only after producing a masterpiece, a work judged flawless by the guild's elders, could he become a master himself, open his own workshop, and take on apprentices of his own. This system controlled quality, limited competition, and ensured that knowledge was passed down intact. The guild's rules were exhaustive. They set the standards for materials, how many threads must be in an inch of cloth, the exact ingredients for a loaf of bread. They fixed prices and wages. They regulated working hours by sunlight, forbade work by candlelight for fear of shoddy results, and maintained a strict monopoly. To undersell a fellow guildsman or to use inferior methods was to face fines, public shame, or expulsion. This created a predictable, if unambitious, stability. But the guild was also a fellowship. It provided a social safety net. If a master fell ill, the guild would support his family. Chapter 14. Fairs. A riot of color and chatter. If the peddler was a trickle of the outside world, the annual fair was a flood. For a few days, usually tied to the feast day of a local saint, a town or large village would transform. The common field or the market square would erupt into a temporary, bustling city of canvas and noise. The fair was the climax of the economic year, a vital, chaotic, and vibrant interruption where the slow accumulation of local produce met the flow of distant commerce. The air itself changed. It became thick with a cacophony of sounds. The lowing of cattle and bleating of sheep in the pens, the shouts of vendors, the clang of a blacksmith setting up a temporary forge, the music of minstrels and pipers hoping for coins. And the smells, the tang of spices from the Orient stall, the sweetness of roasting nuts, the earthy scent of new leather, the sharp aroma of dyed cloth, all layered over the ever-present bass note of animals and humanity. Goods unavailable at any other time appeared as if by magic. Wool merchants from Flanders haggled with English clothiers over sacks of fine fleece. Silks and velvets from Italy and the East were displayed, their colors dazzling against drab homespun. Armorers showed blades from Toledo and Cologne. Apothecaries offered dried fruits, sugar loaves, and mysterious medicinal compounds. It was a sensory overload of plenty. But a fair was more than a market. It was a social event, a carnival. Acrobats tumbled. Bears danced clumsily on chains. Mystery plays were performed on makeshift stages. Food stalls sold pies and pastries. Ale and wine flowed freely. Servants and young people from surrounding manors, released from their duties, could mix and mingle with a rare freedom. Courtship happened here. Friendships were renewed. News from 100 miles away was exchanged in the tavern tents. It was also a place of strict order beneath the chaos. The fair operated under the king's special peace, a temporary BU. Chapter 16. A city street. Mud, midden, and merchants. Let us narrow our focus from the institutions to the very ground beneath their feet. A main thoroughfare in a medieval town is a world unto itself, a rich and challenging sensory experience. Forget the neat, cobbled lanes of later centuries. This is a street of hard-packed earth, a substance that transforms with the weather into a churning river of mud or a cloud of fine, choking dust. It is the stage upon which the daily drama of urban life, in all its raw and pungent vitality, is performed. The first impression is one of profound narrowness. The upper stories of the timber-framed houses lean in toward each other, their jettied facades almost meeting overhead, casting the street below into a perpetual, damp twilight. What light filters down dapples on a scene of constant, jostling movement. Carts loaded with ale barrels or wool sacks fight for space with herds of sheep being driven to market. Pedestrians press against walls to avoid the splash from a passing wheel or the droppings of a packhorse. Underfoot, the mud is not simply earth. It is a composite of the street's entire life. It contains straw, dung, discarded fishbones, broken pottery, and the general refuse tossed from windows with the morning cry of "Gardaloo." The smell is dense and layered. The sharp tang of urine from alleyways, the sour note of spoiling organic matter, the smoky scent from 1,000 hearths, the rich smell of baking bread from a nearby shop, the pungent aroma of a tanner's yard wafting from a side lane. It is an olfactory map of the town's industries and habits. Yet, this is not a place of despair, but of intense, thriving commerce. The ground floors of the houses are workshops, their wide shutters thrown open to the street. The clack of the weaver's loom competes with the tap of the cobbler's hammer. The butcher's stall displays its cuts, attracting clouds of flies. The mercer arranges bolts of cloth in his window. Business Eye. Chapter 17. The Watchman's Call Through the Fog. As the last light faded from the narrow strip of sky between the rooftops, the town entered a different phase. The bustling, noisy commerce of the day retreated behind heavy shutters and barred doors. The street, now empty of carts and crowds, became a place of shadows and echoes. This was the domain of the night, a time of profound vulnerability. And into this silence stepped the watchman, the town's frail guardian against the dangers of the dark. His tools were simple: a lantern, a halberd or stout staff, a set of keys, and his voice. He was not a soldier, but often an older citizen fulfilling a civic duty, or a tradesman taking his turn. His patrol was a slow, solitary circuit along the prescribed lanes, a routine as familiar as the cracks in the cobbles. The pool of light from his lantern swayed rhythmically, catching the gleam of wet stone, the red eyes of a rat, the mist rising from the river. His primary duty was to call the hour and the state of the weather. From the church tower, the bell would toll. Then, his voice would ring out, clear and formulaic, piercing the muffling fog. 11 of the clock, and all is well. Or, if the skies were clear, 2 of the clock, a starlit night, and all is well. This call was a comfort to those lying awake in their beds. It was a signal that order persisted, that a sentinel was awake. It divided the vast, formless night into manageable portions. But his role was also one of enforcement. He checked that the curfew was observed, that no unauthorized lights burned, a fire risk that terrified the tightly packed community. He challenged lone figures, demanding their business. He checked the locks on the Guildhall and the market stalls. He was the ears and eyes for a town that was, for all intents and purposes, blind and deaf. He might rouse a neighbor to douse a smoking chimney, or help a drunk artisan find his door. His night was one of profound solitude, punctuated by the Chapter 18, the Great Hall, smoke and sociability. Within the stone shell of the castle or the timber frame of the manor house, the true heart was the Great Hall. It was not a parlor or a private chamber. It was the central, multi-purpose engine of domestic life for the lord and his entire household. By day, it might serve as a courtroom, a council chamber, or a place of business. But as evening drew in, it transformed into a theater of warmth, community, and shared survival against the encroaching dark and cold. The first and most constant presence was the smoke. A central hearth, or later a fireplace in the sidewall, burned continuously. There was no chimney in the early halls, only a louvre in the high roof to let the smoke escape. It rose in a thick, blue-gray column, curling around the rafters where hams and herbs hung to cure, before slowly finding its way out. The air was hazy, acrid, and warm. Everyone's eyes might water, and clothes would forever carry the scent of wood smoke. This was not an inconvenience. It was the very atmosphere of shelter. As dusk fell, the household gathered. This was not just the Lord's family, but a small society. Knights, men-at-arms, chaplains, clerks, servants, all who lived under his roof. Trestle tables were set up along the sides, benches drawn close. The Lord and his lady sat at a raised dais at one end, under a canopy. The meal, often a single shared pottage or stew served in trenchers of stale bread, was simple and hearty. But the focus was less on the food than on the gathering. This was the time for sociability, for reinforcing bonds. Minstrels might play in the gallery. A traveling storyteller could earn his supper with a tale of King Arthur or a chanson de geste. News was exchanged, local matters discussed. Laughter echoed off the stone. Dogs scavenged for scraps under the tables. It was noisy, warm, and democratic in its own way. Every rank was present, sharing the same smoky air and the same fundamental human need. Chapter 19. The kitchen garden's orderly rows. Behind the manor house, the castle walls, or even the humble cottage, lay a space of quiet, purposeful cultivation. The kitchen garden. This was not the vast, open field for grain, but a smaller, enclosed plot, often hedged about with wattle or stone to keep out rabbits and roaming livestock. Here, the rhythm was not of the ox and the plow, but of the hand and the hoe. This garden was the essential counterpart to the staple diet of bread and pottage, a vital source of flavor, nutrition, and simple medicine. Its layout was one of orderly, practical rows, a small geometry of survival. The plants grown were hardy, reliable, and multi-purpose. Dominant were the alliums, leeks, onions, and garlic, their pungent scent sharp on the air, valued for flavor and believed to ward off illness. There would be cabbages and kale, their tough leaves a green presence through much of the year. Parsnips and carrots, often thinner and woodier than their modern descendants, grew in the loosened soil. Herbs formed a fragrant border or their own dedicated patch. Sage, thyme, rosemary, and mint. These were not mere seasonings. They were the pharmacy used to treat ailments, to preserve meats, and to mask less pleasant tastes. The work here was constant but gentle, often the domain of the women of the household. It was weeding, watering with cans drawn from the well, thinning seedlings, and harvesting with a careful knife. There was a deep, quiet knowledge at play, the knowledge of when to plant by the moon's phase, which herbs to plant together, how to dry bunches for winter use. The garden was a living larder, but also a place of small, personal pride and small beauties. The scent of rosemary in the sun, the purple flash of sage flowers, the orderly satisfaction of straight, green rows. In a life subject to the grand, uncontrollable forces of weather, war, and lordly decree, the kitchen garden represented a sphere of modest but meaningful. Chapter 20. Preserving summer. Salting, pickling, drying. The bounty of harvest and garden was a fleeting promise. Summer's abundance met the hard truth of winter's scarcity, a gap bridged not by magic, but by the slow, deliberate alchemy of preservation. The medieval kitchen did not pause after cooking. It was a laboratory for defeating time, using salt, vinegar, smoke, and air to capture the essence of the warm months and store it in the cool, dark recesses of the pantry or cellar. Salting was the most crucial defense against decay, especially for meat. After the autumn slaughter, when it was impractical to keep all livestock through the winter, sides of beef, pork, and mutton were heavily rubbed with coarse salt, often mixed with saltpeter. They were packed into barrels, layered with more salt, creating an environment where bacteria could not thrive. This produced a product that was indestructible but rock-hard and intensely salty, requiring soaking and boiling to be edible. Fish, particularly herring from the great northern seas, were preserved the same way, packed by the thousands in barrels, their pungent, briny smell a hallmark of coastal towns and monastic larders. Where salt preserved, vinegar transformed. Vegetables from the garden, cabbages, onions, beets, and cucumbers, were submerged in a sharp brew of vinegar, sometimes infused with dill or mustard seed. This pickling not only kept them through the winter but provided a sharp, tangy bite that cut through the monotony of starch and grain. Fruits, like plums or green walnuts, might also be pickled in a sweet and sour syrup, becoming a prized condiment for feast days. Drying employed the simplest element, air. Herbs were tied in bunches and hung from the rafters of the kitchen, their scents slowly permeating the smoky atmosphere. Apples and pears were sliced and laid on racks in a warm, dry corner of the house. Beans and peas were left in their pods to rattle dry on the vine before being stored in sacks. Chapter 21. The communal oven's weekly heat. In the village, not every home possessed the means to bake. The stone hearth could boil and roast, but the perfect, consistent, enveloping heat required for transforming dense, coarse dough into a loaf of bread was a specialized and communal event. This was the purpose of the communal oven, a squat, domed structure of clay and brick, often set apart from the houses for fear of fire. Its firing was a weekly rhythm, a point around which the domestic life of the village pivoted. The process began early with the gathering of fuel. Older children and women would collect bundles of kindling and faggots. The oven's keeper, a man appointed by the manor or the village, would begin the long task of heating the immense thermal mass. He would build a fierce fire directly inside the oven's chamber, feeding it for hours. The stone would drink the heat, growing hotter and hotter until the interior was a blistering, white-lined cavern. The fire was then raked out, the ashes swept clean, and the temperature judged by experience. A handful of flour tossed inside would show if it was ready. Then, the villagers would arrive, each carrying their own shaped loaves, marked with a distinctive cut or a unique dough stamp to identify them. The keeper, using a long, flat wooden peel, would swiftly and skillfully slide the loaves onto the hot oven floor, filling the space with the dough of the entire community. The heavy door would be sealed with clay. For an hour or more, the magic happened. The waiting was a social time, a chance to exchange news while the scent of baking bread, that most fundamental and comforting of smells, began to seep from the oven, perfuming the air. When the door was finally opened, the transformed loaves were drawn out, crusty, golden brown, and hollow-sounding when tapped. Each family collected their own. The bread represented the week's sustenance, its solidity a comfort. The residual heat of the oven might then be us. Chapter 22, Potage, the perpetual simmering pot. On the hearth of nearly every cottage, manor kitchen, and monastic refectory, there sat a constant companion, the iron pot suspended over the low fire. Within it, a concoction simmered with a quiet, patient persistence. This was potage. It was not a specific recipe, but a concept, a method, a daily reality. It was the edible expression of medieval life, resourceful, slow, and deeply dependent on what was available. Its base was water or, if one was fortunate, broth. Into this liquid went the foundational grain, oats, barley, or rye, in the form of meal or rough crumbs of bread. This provided the thickening, the body, the bulk that fought off hunger. Then came the gleanings from the kitchen garden. Chopped leeks, onions, cabbages, turnips or parsnips, a few peas or beans from the stored sack. If it was a feast day, or in a wealthy household, shreds of salted meat or a ham bone might be added for flavor and precious fat. Herbs from the bunch hanging nearby, sage, thyme, parsley, were crumbled in. There was no single moment of serving. The pot was rarely empty. As it was eaten, more water, more vegetables, more grain would be added, so that the potage was in a state of perpetual renewal. It might taste slightly different from day to day, week to week, as the seasons changed the available ingredients. In a poor household, it might be little more than thin gruel with a handful of greens. In a rich one, it could be a thick, hearty stew. But its purpose was universal: to provide a warm, filling meal with minimal waste, using every scrap. It was eaten from wooden bowls or directly from the trencher. A thick slice of stale bread that served as both plate and spoon, soaking up the broth until it became soft and edible itself. It was the midday meal, often the evening meal. It was the food of the field worker and the monk, the peasant child and the Lord's servant. The potage pot was the silent, bubbling heart of the kitchen. Chapter 23, Ale, the drink of every day. In a world of uncertain water, the universal and essential drink was ale. It was not the strong, hopped beer of later centuries, but a simpler, milder, cloudier brew, made from malted barley, water, and yeast, and flavored with a mix of herbs known as grut. It was a staple, as necessary as bread, consumed by everyone from children to the elderly, at every meal and throughout the day. Its alcoholic content was low, but its importance was profound. It was a source of calories, a safe liquid, and a gentle, social intoxicant that blurred the harsh edges of daily life. Brewing was women's work, a domestic art practiced in homes great and small. The process was slow and physical. Barley was soaked, allowed to germinate, then dried in a kiln to become malt. This malt was crushed and mixed with hot water in a large tub to extract the sugars, creating a sweet liquid called wort. The wort was then boiled, often with grut, a mixture of herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, and rosemary that acted as a preservative and bittering agent before hops became common. After cooling, yeast was introduced, and the fermentation began in open crocks. The result was a perishable, living drink. It soured quickly, usually within a few days. This meant brewing was a near-constant weekly chore. The taste varied wildly from batch to batch and from household to household, ranging from sweet and porridge-like to sharply acidic. It was nutrient-rich, often described as liquid bread. To drink water alone was considered risky, even foolish, for water could carry sickness. Ale was seen as purified, transformed by the brewing process. It was served in wooden tankards or jugs. It accompanied the morning potage, refreshed the field worker at noon, and fueled the evening conversation in the hall. In the tavern, it was the currency of gossip and deal-making. It was a small, daily pleasure, a humble, frothy constant. The smell of brewing, the earthy scent of malt. Chapter 24. The romance of the courtly love ideal. Amidst the mud, labor, and simmering pottage, there flourished a delicate and elaborate daydream. The ideal of courtly love. This was not the practical marriage alliance that forged political bonds and secured land. It was a refined, literary, and often deeply artificial game, a set of rules and rituals performed in the courts of nobility. It provided a script for emotion, a way to speak of love as a distant, shining, and ultimately unattainable perfection. The code was precise and paradoxical. The lover, always a knight or courtier, would dedicate himself not to his wife, but to a lady, usually of higher rank and married to another. His love was to be a source of anguish and exquisite refinement. He would suffer nobly, worship from afar, compose elaborate poems of praise and lament, and perform daring deeds of chivalry, not for personal glory, but solely to honor her. The lady herself was a passive icon, a mirror of all virtue and beauty. She was distant, cold, and capricious, her favor a rare and precious gift that spurred her knight to greater heights of courage and courtesy. This love was never meant to be consummated. Its entire power lay in its impossibility. To possess the lady would shatter the ideal. The tension, the yearning, the endless service. This was the engine of the fantasy. It was a form of emotional alchemy, designed to transform raw desire into a force for moral and social improvement. By channeling his passion into this rigid form, a rough knight was theoretically polished into a paragon of gentility, patience, and artistic sensitivity. For the noble women who were its objects, it offered a strange new kind of social power. Within the game, she held absolute sovereignty over her admirer's heart and public reputation. She could command songs, inspire quests, and be the central subject of art. It was a small, glittering sphere of influence in a life often bound by duty. In reality, it was a lit era. Chapter 25. Minstrels and Troubadours. Stories set to strings. The ideals of courtly love, the glories of ancient heroes, and the news of distant lands did not travel on parchment alone. They were carried on the air, set to melody, by a wandering class of entertainers, the minstrels and troubadours. They were the living soundtrack of the age, the human conduit for story and song, moving from castle hall to market square, trading their art for coin, a meal, or a night's shelter. The minstrel was the broader term, a versatile performer. He might be a soloist or part of a small troupe. His tools were portable: a lute, a vielle, a early fiddle, a harp, or simple pipes and a tabor drum. His repertoire was vast and adaptable. In the smoky great hall after supper, he would sing the lengthy chansons de geste, epic tales of Charlemagne and Roland, his voice rising and falling with the clatter of swords and the grief of heroic death. For a lighter moment, he might offer a fablio, a bawdy, comic story of cheating wives and foolish peasants, guaranteed to raise laughter. He was a mimic, a juggler, a teller of news, his survival dependent on his ability to capture and hold the attention of his patrons. The troubadour, originating in the sun-drenched courts of southern France, was a more refined figure, often a nobleman himself. He was the architect of the courtly love lyric. His songs, composed in the intricate Occitan language, were not mere entertainment but sophisticated poetry set to complex melodies. He sang of Finamore, refined love, of his lady's unbearable beauty and his own virtuous suffering. The focus was on the intricate emotion, the paradox of joyful pain. His performance was less about boisterous showmanship and more about creating an atmosphere of refined melancholy and intellectual yearning. Whether a humble minstrel with a worn fiddle or a proud troubadour with a finely crafted lute, their role was vital. They were memory keepers and myth makers. In a world why. Chapter 26. The rules of the tournament beyond the joust. The tournament is often pictured as a single, dramatic clash of lances. But in its full form, it was a vast, days-long spectacle. A complex ritual blending sport, warfare, and social theater. It was governed by a thicket of rules and customs. A temporary world where violence was channeled into ceremony, and where a knight could win fortune, fame, and honor before an audience of his peers. The centerpiece was indeed the joust, a test of individual skill. But this was preceded by the melee, a mock battle between teams of knights that could range across miles of countryside. Though blunted weapons were often used, it was a brutal, chaotic affair, closer to real combat than sport, with the objective of capturing opponents for ransom. Horses thundered, swords clashed, and the dust rose in great clouds. It was a training ground for war, but also a public display of a lord's military household and its cohesion. The rules, enforced by heralds and judges, were meticulous. There were strict conventions on who could strike where. A blow to the horse was a grave dishonor. The type of armor and weapons were regulated. A knight had to prove his noble lineage to participate. The rituals were elaborate. The display of heraldic banners, the dedicating of one's performance to a lady who might give him a sleeve or scarf to wear, the formal challenges issued days in advance. It was a pageant of identity, where a man was his coat of arms and his public deeds. Beyond the field, the tournament was a sprawling economic and social event. Merchants set up stalls. Tents pavilioned the field, creating a colorful, temporary city of silk and pennants. There were feasts, dances, and opportunities for political negotiation. For the winning knight, the rewards were immense. The ransom money from captured opponents, their valuable horses and armor, and most prized of all, a soaring reputation. A champion's name would be sung by minstrel. Chapter 27. Heraldry. A language of colors and beasts. In a world where most could not read, identity was worn, not written. It was proclaimed in vibrant, symbolic language across a knight's shield, the trapper of his horse, and the banner flying above his tent. This was heraldry, a sophisticated visual code born on the battlefield but flowering into a complete system of social and familial identification. It was a silent shout in the chaos, a way to say exactly who you were and where you came from, without uttering a single word. The need was practical. When a knight was encased head to toe in identical steel armor, his face hidden behind a closed helm, distinguishing friend from foe in the dust and din of the melee was a matter of life and death. A bold, unique pattern of colors and shapes on his shield, his coat of arms, became his face. Heralds, the masters of this visual language, would memorize these designs, identifying knights by their arms and announcing them as they entered the lists. The rules of this language, called blazonry, were precise and poetic. The palette was limited to a few vivid tinctures, metals like argent, silver/white, and/or gold/yellow, and colors like gules, red, azure, blue, sable, black, and vert, green. Patterns, called ordinaries, divided the shield with simple, bold shapes: a cross, a band, a chevron. Upon this field, the charges were placed: lions for courage, eagles for empire, fleurs-de-lis for purity, mythical beasts like griffins, or simple, local symbols like a sheaf of wheat or a mill rind. This was not mere decoration. It was inheritance. A father's arms would be passed to his sons with slight, regulated modifications, like a label or a bowyer, to mark the difference between the heir and his younger brothers. It tied a man to his lineage, his land, and his honor. It was displayed on everything: seals for authenticating documents, stained glass in the parish church, embroidered on clothing, carved into stone. Chapter 29. The peasant's cot, wattle, daub, and thatched roof. The dwelling of the common people was not a home in the modern sense, but a shelter, a simple, organic extension of the landscape. The peasant's cot was a living structure, built from materials at hand, designed for utility and warmth rather than permanence or privacy. Its construction was a familiar, communal skill, and its form varied little across the countryside. Its bones were of wood. Sturdy posts of oak or ash were driven into the ground, forming a rectangular frame. Between these posts, the walls were woven from flexible hazel or willow withes in a lattice pattern known as wattle. This lattice was then daubed, plastered, with a thick mixture of clay, soil, animal dung, and straw. This daub dried to a hard, insulating crust. It was not waterproof and would wash away in heavy rains, requiring constant patching and maintenance. The roof was a thick, layered thatch of reeds or straw, tied down with ropes against the wind. From a distance, the cot seemed to grow from the earth itself, a low, humped form hugging the ground. The interior was one single room, a multi-purpose space for people and often their most valuable livestock. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that were changed infrequently. At the center was the hearth, the literal and figurative heart of the home. Its smoke filled the upper part of the room, slowly seeping out through a hole in the thatch, curing the rafters and everything hanging from them with a patina of soot. Light came from the fire, and perhaps a single, small, shuttered opening glass was an unthinkable luxury. In this dim, smoky space, all of life occurred. The family slept on pallets of straw near the warmth. Food was prepared and eaten. Tools were mended. Children were born. The air was close, thick with the smells of smoke, damp earth, sweat, and animals. It was a place of profound intimacy with the elements and with one another off-Erin. Chapter 28. The Ideal of Chivalry and Its Frequent Lapse. Chivalry was the shining code meant to govern the knightly class, a lofty set of virtues intended to transform a trained warrior into a Christian gentleman. It was a blend of military prowess, religious devotion, and courtly manners. The sword, the cross, and the rose. The ideal knight was to be brave in battle, loyal to his lord, generous to the weak, devout in his prayers, and courteous to all, especially ladies. He was the armed hand of justice, the defender of the faith, and the paragon of social grace. This was the beautiful theory. The reality, as with all human ideals, was often a stark and grimy contrast. The same knight who might devoutly hear Mass in the morning could lead a chevauchée, a brutal, burning raid through enemy territory in the afternoon, where the weak he was meant to protect became the peasantry whose crops he torched and whose homes he pillaged. Loyalty to one's lord frequently trumped any higher justice, leading to petty wars and local tyrannies. The protection of ladies, so fervently sung in romances, did little to alter the practical realities of arranged marriages or the vulnerability of women outside the noble class. The code was elastic, often serving as a glossy veneer over raw power and self-interest. A knight could justify almost any violent action if framed as a matter of honor or a response to an insult. The tournament, the training ground for chivalry, was as much about capturing rivals for lucrative ransom as it was about demonstrating virtue. The church itself constantly struggled to temper the knightly impulse towards violence, creating orders like the Templars to channel it, and promoting the concept of the peace of God to limit its targets. Yet, the ideal's power lay not in its consistent practice, but in its existence as a measure. It was a standard to appeal to, a language of justification and shame. A lord accused of cruelty might be chastised for acting unchanged. Chapter 30. The Single Room. Living, sleeping, dwelling. Within the humble shell of the cot, there existed no division, no hallway, no private chamber. Life unfolded in a single, shared room. This was not a place of specialized function, but a universal stage where every human activity, sleeping, eating, working, birthing, dying, was performed in full view, within arm's reach of the hearth's glow. It was a world of profound proximity, where the concept of solitude was as rare and foreign as a pane of glass. The space was organized by necessity, not design. The hearth was the fixed point, the sun around which this small universe orbited. Opposite the door, to avoid drafts, it provided heat, light, and the means for cooking. Around it, the most valued possessions were kept. The iron pot, a simple trivet, perhaps a stool. The walls were lined with the few tools of existence. The wooden plowshare, the hoe, the flax comb, a fishing net. Bundles of herbs and dried vegetables hung from the sooty rafters, slowly flavoring the air and preserving the summer's yield. Sleeping arrangements were communal and pragmatic. There were no bedrooms. The family slept together on sacks stuffed with straw, laid out on the earthen floor or on a simple wooden platform, sharing whatever blankets and animal pelts they owned. Warmth was survival, and shared body heat was a crucial resource on winter nights. The distinction between day and night was marked not by moving to a different room, but by the drawing in of activity, the settling onto the pallets, the dying of the fire to embers. In this one room, generations overlapped. The elderly grandfather might mend a net by the light of the single window as a mother nursed an infant by the fire and children played with a simple wooden toy on the floor. Arguments, affections, illnesses, and recoveries all happened here, in the open. There was no privacy, but there was a deep, constant togetherness. The single room fostered a collective existing. Chapter 31. The Hearth, Heart of the Home. In the single, shadowed room of the cottage, the hearth was more than a source of heat. It was the absolute center, the vital organ of the home. It defined the space, dictated the rhythms of the day, and held a significance that bordered on the sacred. Its fire was a living thing, coaxed, fed, and guarded with a care bordering on reverence, for its failure meant more than discomfort. It meant darkness, cold, and hunger. The hearth itself was simple, a flat stone or a clay-lined depression in the center of the earthen floor, sometimes with a backing stone to reflect heat. Above it, from a soot-blackened beam, hung an iron chain with a hook, from which the cooking pot could be raised or lowered over the flames. This fire was rarely allowed to die completely. At night, it was banked with ashes, preserving a core of glowing embers that could be breathed back to life at dawn. Starting a fire from scratch with flint and tinder was a difficult, tedious task, so the continuity of the hearth fire symbolized the continuity of the household itself. Its functions were universal. It was the cooker, simmering the perpetual potage and toasting grains. It was the furnace, heating water for the rare wash or for treating illness. It was the sole source of light after sunset, painting the room in a dancing, orange glow, casting immense, moving shadows on the walls. It dried wet clothes, cured meats, and hardened clay. People arranged themselves around it in a strict, unspoken hierarchy, with the best spots reserved for the elders and the most vulnerable. Beyond the practical, the hearth was a symbol of sanctuary. The phrase hearth and home spoke of its deep cultural roots. To be welcomed to someone's hearth was to be brought into their trust. Spirits of the household were believed to dwell within its stones. The sweeping of the hearth was done with care, never completely, lest good fortune be swept away with the ashes. In a life exposed. Chapter 32. Rushlights. Painting with flickering shadows. After the sun set and the last gray light faded from the single window, the world inside the cottage contracted to the circle of firelight. But for tasks that required moving beyond the hearth's direct glow, or for extending the day even a little, there was another, humbler source of illumination: the rushlight. This was not a candle as we know it, but the most basic and economical form of artificial light, a slow-burning wick of nature itself. The making of it was a seasonal, domestic chore. In summer or early autumn, the tall, common rushes were gathered from the banks of streams or marshes. They were peeled with a careful twist, leaving a single, narrow strip of the green outer skin to act as a spine. The exposed, pithy inner core was then carefully drawn through a pan of warm, rendered animal fat, usually mutton or beef tallow. The porous pith would soak up the fat like a sponge. Once saturated, the rush was set aside to harden. The process was repeated to build up layers, creating a thin, greasy torch that could burn for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. To use it, the rushlight was clamped in a simple iron holder, often with a pincer-like grip. It was angled slightly downward so the melting tallow would not drip too quickly. When lit, it did not produce a clear, steady flame like a beeswax candle. Instead, it sputtered and hissed, burning with a small, uneven, and smoky flame. The light it cast was meager and tremulous, a pulsating island of dim, orange glow that pushed back the darkness only a foot or two. It was a light for mending a fishing net by, for a mother soothing a child, for finding one's way to the pallet, not for reading or fine work. This faint, dancing light painted the room in a new way. It exaggerated the movement of shadows, making familiar objects seem to shift and breathe. Faces were carved into masks of deep hollows and highlighted cheekbones. It was a light that demanded the eyes. Chapter 33. The Medieval Moon, Illuminating the Night World. When the hearth embers faded and the last rushlight guttered out, the only light remaining was that of the moon. In a world without street lamps or light pollution, the medieval night was a realm of profound, velvety blackness, broken only by the stars and the moon's slow journey across the sky. The moon was not merely a celestial body. It was a practical, influential, and often mystical companion, its phases dictating the rhythms of work, travel, and the imagination. Its practical light was a form of stolen time. On nights when the moon was full or near full, its silver-blue glow could be surprisingly bright, casting sharp, black shadows and painting the landscape in monochrome. This was borrowed day. Extra work could be done. Urgent repairs, late harvesting if the weather threatened. Travel was safer, as the track could be seen, reducing the risk of stumbling into a ditch or a lurking danger. A night journey, undertaken by a messenger or a peddler keen to make time, was planned around the lunar calendar. The moonlight was a tangible, useful resource, as real as a torch. This light also transformed the familiar. The village, so known and ordinary by day, became an unfamiliar place of stark contrasts and deep pools of mystery. The church tower stood as a black sentinel against the starry sky. The thatched roofs became rumpled silver blankets. Every tree cast a long, skeletal shadow. Sounds carried farther and seemed more significant. The call of an owl, the rustle of a hedgehog, the distant bark of a fox. The world was the same, yet completely different, viewed through a cool, silent filter. Inevitably, this transformation bred superstition. The moon was linked to growth and decay, to the tides of the human body and mind. Lunacy was believed to be influenced by its light. Planting and harvesting were often timed to its waxing and waning. It was a celestial clock, a lamp, and a capricious god. To walk a. Chapter 34. Superstition in the hearth and field. The medieval world was one of immense uncertainty. Life hung by threads vulnerable to blight, plague, childbirth, and storm. In the absence of scientific understanding, a parallel, intricate system of belief flourished to explain the unexplainable and exert a sliver of control over the uncontrollable. This was not a separate realm of superstition, but a woven part of daily reality, as present as the hearthstone or the plow. It was a logic of signs, symbols, and small, potent rituals. The home was a fortress to be spiritually guarded. The threshold was particularly vulnerable. Horseshoes, symbols of the protective crescent moon and forged iron, which repelled evil, were nailed above doors. Rowan twigs were hung to ward off witches. Salt, precious and purifying, was spilled with care, and to sweep dust out the door after sunset was to risk sweeping out the family's luck. The hearth fire itself was a living spirit. Its embers were never fully extinguished, and to let it die was an omen of death or disaster. The cracking of a log could foretell a visitor. In the field, the stakes were survival. Every phase of farming was attended by ritual. Plowing might begin on a day ruled by a favorable saint. Seeds were sometimes blessed by the parish priest. Strange stones found while tilling, known as plowman's pennies or fairy stones, were kept as lucky charms for the harvest. The last sheaf of corn, the spirit of the field, was woven into a corn dolly and brought to the farmhouse with ceremony, to be kept until the next planting to ensure the spirit's return. The natural world was a text to be read. The flight patterns of birds, the entrails of a slaughtered pig, the dreams on a certain night. All were omens. A cow giving birth to twins could be a sign of good fortune or an ill portent, depending on the village's lore. This was not simple fear, it was a form of navigation. By observing these signs and performing Chapter 35. The Village Saint's Day. Work gives way to play. For all but a handful of days in the year, life was toil. But the calendar, governed by the church, provided sanctioned escapes, islands of obligatory leisure. The greatest of these was the feast day of the parish's patron saint. This was more than a mass. It was the village's annual festival, a day when the relentless rhythm of labor was not just paused but joyously overturned. It was a collective exhalation, a time for the community to celebrate itself. The religious core came first. The entire village would don their best clothes, the ones not stained with mud or sweat, and processed to the church. The saint's statue might be paraded, garlanded with flowers. A special mass was said, giving thanks for the saint's intercession and praying for continued protection. This solemnity fulfilled the day's duty to God and the saint, and in doing so, sanctified the revelry to come. For after the Mass, the green before the church or the Lord's manor transformed. Trestle tables were laden with food. The communal oven had worked overtime to produce special white bread. Ale, brewed stronger than the daily small beer, flowed freely from barrels. There might be a roast pig, a rare taste of fresh meat for many. The ordinary rules of diet and decorum relaxed. Then came the games. These were simple, physical, and communal. There was wrestling, foot races, and archery contests. There might be a fiercely contested game of village football, a chaotic, boundless scrum with few rules, played with an inflated pig's bladder. For the children, there were races and simple prizes. Minstrels or traveling players might perform a mystery play or a farce. It was a day of loud noise, laughter, and unchecked energy, a stark contrast to the quiet, disciplined grind of everyday survival. For one day, the hierarchy softened. Lord and peasant might share the same space, watching the same games, united by the shared identity of the parish. Chapter 36. Simple games. Dice, skittles, and 9 men's Morris. When the saint's day ended and the long evenings in the cottage stretched out, entertainment had to be conjured from very little. There were no manufactured toys, no screens, no vast libraries. But the human desire for play, for competition, and for a mental escape was as strong then as now. It found expression in simple, ancient games, played with pieces carved from wood or bone on boards scratched into a tabletop or a smooth patch of earth. Games of pure chance, like dice, were universal. A set of knuckle bones, actual animal bones, or carved 6-sided dice were small enough to carry in a pouch, played for small stakes. A pin, a drink, a favor. They were a quick, thrilling diversion in taverns or by the fireside. The rattle and roll of the dice was a sound of hope and groans. A tiny ritual of fortune that required no skill, only luck, making every player, from lord to laborer, equal before its whims. Games of physical skill were also common. Skittles, an early form of 9-pin bowling, was played in courtyards and tavern yards. A wooden ball was rolled to knock down pins, a test of aim and force. It was a game for laughter and camaraderie. The crash of the pins a satisfying sound of minor triumph. But the most widespread intellectual pastime was the board game. 9 men's Morris, known also as Merrills, was a favorite. This grid could be drawn anywhere. 2 players each had 9 pieces, or men, and the goal was to form lines of 3, allowing a player to remove an opponent's piece. It was a game of strategy and foresight, deceptively simple but capable of deep tactical play. It required no equipment but a sharp stone to scratch the board and 2 sets of distinguishable pebbles or bits of straw. It was played in moments of respite in the fields, by guards on duty, by families in the evening. These games were more than distractions. They were social glue, a way to bond, to challenge, to engage. Chapter 37. The unending toil of women's work. The life of a medieval woman, regardless of station, was defined by a cycle of labor that knew no true end. It was work that filled every waking hour, work that was rarely celebrated in song or chronicle, but which formed the essential, unglamorous foundation upon which all of society rested. It was a quiet, relentless engine of maintenance and survival. From dawn until long after dusk, her hands were rarely still. The day began with the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life, fetching water from the well or stream, beginning the simmering pottage that would feed the household. Then came the processing of raw materials into usable goods. This was the endless textile cycle. Spinning wool or flax into thread with a drop spindle was a task that could be done while watching children, while walking, in any spare moment. The thread was then woven into cloth on a loom, a larger, more stationary task. That cloth was then cut and sewn into garments, darned, patched, and passed down. There was the relentless preparation of food, beyond cooking. Grinding grain with a hand quern was backbreaking labor. Salting meat, pickling vegetables, brewing ale, baking bread, these were not weekly events but constant seasonal necessities. In a peasant household, she would also work in the garden, tend to the few chickens or the pig, and help in the fields during peak times like harvest. Childbearing and rearing were themselves a form of immense physical labor and risk, woven into this tapestry of chores. There was no division between work and home. The home was her workshop. For a noblewoman, the scale changed but the nature remained. She managed a vast, complex household, a small business, overseeing servants, stores, and the health of all within its walls. Her work was administration and supervision, but it was no less constant or critical. This toil was unseen by the chroniclers who recorded battles and treaties. It left no grand. Chapter 39. The Parish Church, the anchor of the community. Amidst the scattered cottages and fields, one structure stood as the physical and spiritual center for every soul in the parish, the parish church. It was not merely a place for Sunday Mass. It was the anchor of the community, the point around which all life, from cradle to grave, revolved. Its stone walls housed the rituals that marked the passage of time, both for the individual and for the collective. Its bell was the village's clock. It called the faithful to prayer, but also marked the hours for work, signaled a death, or tolled an alarm. The sound carried across the plowed strips and the common grazing land, a constant auditory reminder of a shared identity. The churchyard itself was the community's final resting place, the ground where generations lay side by side, literally rooted in the parish soil. Inside, the church was a familiar, if often dim and cold, sanctuary. The walls might be painted with vivid frescoes depicting heaven and hell, the Last Judgment, and the lives of the saints. A poor man's Bible, teaching theology through color and image. The liturgy, spoken in Latin, was a mysterious and sonorous backdrop, but the rituals were deeply personal. Here, a child was baptized and given a name, entering the community of Christians. Here, a couple was married, their union blessed. Here, the dead were mourned and commended to God. Each sacrament tied a personal milestone to the sacred, witnessed by the entire parish. It was also a social and legal hub. Meetings were held in the nave. Proclamations were read from the church door. Oaths were sworn on the Bible. The church ale, a fundraising feast, might be held in the yard. The priest, often a local man of little education but deep familiarity, was a figure of authority and counsel. The parish church was the one institution that touched every life at every stage, providing a framework of meaning, a calendar of observance, and a profound sense of. Chapter 38. Childhood. A brief and practical apprenticeship. The medieval concept of childhood was fleeting, a brief preparatory stage for the serious business of adulthood. There was little room for prolonged innocence or idle play. From the moment a child could walk and understand simple commands, they were integrated into the economy of the household and the land. Their upbringing was a practical apprenticeship for the life they were destined to lead, shaped entirely by the station of their birth. For peasant children, this meant work as soon as they were able. A small child might be tasked with scaring birds from the newly sown fields. Slightly older ones would gather firewood, fetch water, collect eggs, or tend to younger siblings. By 7 or 8, they would be working alongside their parents in earnest, boys following their fathers to learn plowing and animal husbandry. girls working with their mothers at the endless tasks of the hearth, the garden, and the textile crafts. Their education was not in letters, but in the skills of survival. Play was snatched in moments with simple homemade toys or games, but it was never the primary occupation. For the children of craftsmen or merchants, the path was more formal but equally purposeful. At around the age of 7, a boy might be formally bound as an apprentice to a master, not necessarily his father, for a term of 7 years. He left his own home to live in his master's household, learning the trade from the ground up. A girl might be sent to another household to learn domestic management or a craft like silkwork or embroidery, often with an eye toward making a good marriage. Even noble childhood was a training ground. Boys were sent to other noble households as pages from age 7, to learn service, manners, horsemanship, and the basics of combat. Girls were taught to manage a household, to weave and embroider, skills of management as much as art, and to behave with the decorum befitting their rank. Chapter 40. The cycle of baptism, marriage, and funeral rites. From the first cry to the final silence, life was framed and given meaning by the rites of the church. These were not private family events, but public, communal ceremonies that integrated the individual into the body of the parish and marked their passage through the stages of earthly existence. Baptism, marriage, and the funeral formed a sacred trilogy, a rhythm of welcome, union, and farewell that ordered the human journey. Baptism followed birth with urgent speed, often within days. Infant mortality was a terrifying specter, and an unbaptized soul was believed barred from heaven, doomed to limbo. The ritual was therefore a race against time. The mother, still confined to her childbed, would not attend. The godparents, chosen for their social standing and piety, carried the swaddled infant to the church font. The priest performed the exorcism of original sin, anointed with holy oil, and poured the water, welcoming the child into the Christian community and giving it a name. This spiritual kinship created bonds as strong as blood, with godparents pledging to ensure the child's religious education. Marriage was as much a social and economic contract as a spiritual one, but the church's blessing sanctified the union. The ceremony was simple, often conducted at the church door rather than inside, emphasizing its public nature. The couple exchanged vows of consent, "I will," before witnesses. Rings were blessed and given. The priest then led them inside for a nuptial mass. The community's presence was essential. It witnessed the vows that created a new economic unit and ensured legitimate heirs. Afterwards, the real celebration began with a feast, but the church's rite had turned a practical arrangement into a holy sacrament. The funeral was the community's final act of care. Death was a public event. The body was washed and watched over in the home. The funeral procession with the tolling bell moved Fr. Chapter 41. The ever-present shadow of sickness. Health in the medieval world was a precarious state, a temporary respite in a life shadowed by the constant threat of sickness. There was no germ theory, no antibiotics, no understanding of how disease truly spread. Illness was an intimate, terrifying, and mysterious companion, striking without discernible reason and explained through a lens of divine punishment, planetary influence, or malevolent magic. Its presence was a fact of life, as ordinary and as dreadful as the winter cold. The symptoms were often more familiar than their causes. Agues and fevers came with the damp seasons. Respiratory ailments flourished in smoky, crowded dwellings. Skin infections and parasites were commonplace. Childhood diseases like measles and smallpox carried off the young with brutal efficiency. But the great, looming terror was plague, the Black Death, which swept in periodic waves, reducing families and whole villages to silence in a matter of days. Even in plague-free years, its memory was a fresh horror, a reminder of how fragile the human web truly was. The response to sickness was a mixture of the practical, the pious, and the superstitious. The first recourse was often home care, herbal teas, poultices, and the warmth of the hearth. If the illness persisted, one might seek the local wise woman, whose knowledge of plants was deep, or the barber surgeon, who could set a bone or bleed a patient according to humoral theory. Prayer was a constant. Vows were made to saints, pilgrimages pledged if one recovered. Amulets and charms were worn, Crucially, sickness was rarely a private affair. In the single-room cot, illness was witnessed by all. In a world without hospitals, the sick were nursed at home, their care falling to the women of the household. The community might help, but fear of contagion could also lead to isolation. The shadow of sickness shaped every aspect of life, from the prayers said daily to the way one viewed NEI. Chapter 42. The Herbalist's Gentle Remedies. In the face of mysterious and terrifying illness, the first line of defense was often the quiet, empirical knowledge of the herbalist. This was usually a woman, the village wise woman, a monastic infirmer, or simply a grandmother with a lifetime of observation. Her practice was not magic, though it bordered on it. It was a deep, intimate familiarity with the plants that grew in the hedge, the forest edge, and the kitchen garden. Her pharmacy was the living landscape, and her art was in knowing how to unlock its gentle virtues. Her knowledge was passed down through practice and word of mouth, a oral tradition as valuable as any written text. She knew which plants to gather and when, often at specific times of day or phases of the moon, when their virtues were believed to be strongest. Metasweet for pain and fever, its sweet scent a comfort. Chamomile for troubled sleep and digestion. Comfrey, called knit bone, for poultices to mend sprains and fractures. Yarrow to staunch bleeding. Lavender to soothe headaches and calm agitation. These were not exotic imports, but common plants, their uses honed over generations of trial and observation. The preparations were simple but deliberate. Leaves and flowers might be steeped in hot water to make a tisane. Roots were boiled into decoctions. Oils were infused by steeping herbs in warmed almond or olive oil. For wounds and swellings, fresh herbs were crushed into a poultice and bound with clean linen. Salves were made by mixing infused oils with beeswax. The herbalist understood dosage and combination, knowing that some plants, like foxglove, digitalis, for the heart, were powerful and dangerous in equal measure. Her role extended beyond the physical. The act of gathering and preparing was a ritual of care. A visit from the wise woman brought not just potential remedy, but comfort, a listening ear, and the authority of tradition. While the learned physician with his uroscopy flasks. Chapter 43. The Traveling Leech and His Dubious Arts. For ailments deemed beyond the scope of the herbalist's garden, one might turn to a more dramatic, and often more perilous, figure, the traveling leech or barber surgeon. He was a practitioner of the manual arts of medicine, a man who carried his tools in a worn leather bag and his reputation in the stories of those he had treated. His methods were direct, physical, and grounded in the prevailing, and often flawed medical theories of the age. His most common procedure was bloodletting or phlebotomy. Based on the humoral theory, illness was seen as an imbalance of the body's four humors. An excess of blood, particularly, was believed to cause fever and inflammation. The leech would use a lancet to open a vein, often at the elbow or foot, and drain a measured amount of blood into a bowl. The desired effect was a weakening of the patient to reduce the feverish heat. In reality, it often weakened an already sick person catastrophically. He might also apply leeches, the actual worms, to suck blood from specific sites, a slower, gentler method. His surgery was brutal and pragmatic. He could set broken bones with splints, amputate gangrenous limbs with a saw, a horrific, last-resort operation performed with alcohol as the only anesthetic, and lance painful boils or abscesses. He might treat wounds with cauterization, searing them with a hot iron to stop bleeding and prevent infection, a method that caused immense suffering but could sometimes seal a grievous injury. His knowledge of anatomy was often rudimentary, gleaned from experience rather than formal study. He was a figure of ambiguous standing. He was needed for his courage to perform horrific necessary tasks, but he was also feared and distrusted. His work was messy, painful, and had a high mortality rate. He traveled because a community could not sustain his grim trade full-time. He was part craftsman, part performer, selling hope with a steady hand and ASH. Chapter 44. The Boundaries of Life. Hedge, wall, and ditch. The medieval landscape was not a wilderness, but a carefully partitioned world. Ownership, responsibility, and community were defined not by maps and titles alone, but by physical boundaries that everyone understood. These markers, the hedge, the wall, and the ditch, were the quiet syntax of the land, writing the rules of daily life in living wood, enduring stone, and excavated earth. The most common boundary was the hedge. It was not a decorative shrubbery, but a thick, impenetrable barrier often made of hawthorn, blackthorn, or hazel, planted and woven together in a living fence called a hedgelang. It was a work of slow, skilled craft. Its purpose was absolute, to keep livestock in one place and out of another. The hedgerow marked the edge of the Lord's domain, the boundary between the open arable fields and the common pasture, or the limit of a freeholder's croft. It provided shelter for birds and forage for bees, but its primary identity was as a line of sovereign territory. For more permanent, important divisions, there was the stone wall. It spoke of greater investment and permanence. It might encircle the manor's inner garden, the churchyard, or the monastic precinct. A stone wall was a statement of status and security, marking a space set apart for prayer, privacy, or power. It kept the world at a more formal distance than the hedge. The ditch, often paired with a raised bank or hedge, was a boundary that worked by negation. It was a gap, a hollow. It marked drainage courses between fields, defined parish boundaries, or served as a defensive perimeter. To cross a boundary ditch without right was a trespass as clear as climbing a wall. Maintaining these boundaries was a communal duty enforced by the manor court. A broken hedge meant straying cattle and damaged crops. A neglected ditch could flood a neighbor's field. These lines in the land were the framework of order, preventing the constant Fr. Chapter 45. The slow exchange of news and gossip. In a world without newspapers, telephones, or swift travel, information moved at the speed of a walking person, a trotting horse, or a wagon's creaking wheel. News was a precious, slowly fermented commodity, passed from mouth to ear, changing subtly with each telling. Its journey was the journey of people. The peddler on the road, the pilgrim returning from a shrine, the carter delivering goods to market, the servant visiting a neighboring manor. The primary forum for this exchange was the marketplace, the churchyard after Mass, the tavern in the evening, or the communal well. Here, in knots of conversation, the news was shared. It might be momentous. Word of a distant battle, the death of a king, a new tax levied by the Lord. More often, it was intensely local. The miller's daughter was to be married. A ewe had twin lambs at the home farm. A blight was seen on the wheat in the next parish. This gossip was not idle chatter. It was the social and economic intelligence network of the community. Knowing who was in debt, who was ill, who had a surplus for sale, was crucial knowledge for survival. The reliability of this information was always in question. Details blurred with distance and repetition. A levy for a castle's repair could transform into a tale of imminent war by the time it reached the third village. The news carried by a traveling friar might be more accurate than that of a drunken drover. People learned to weigh the source. The Lord's steward brought authoritative news. The gleeman's song might contain a kernel of truth wrapped in poetic license. This slow exchange created a different sense of time and space. An event that happened a week's journey away was fresh news when it arrived. The world felt both vast because news took so long to travel, and intimately small because all news was personal, passed between known individuals. Rumors could swell and take on a life of their own, causing panic or hope. Chapter 46. The deep comfort of familiar rhythms. Amidst the uncertainty of sickness, the burden of labor, and the vagaries of weather and lordly will, there existed a profound psychological anchor, the deep, unchanging comfort of familiar rhythms. Life was not a linear march toward progress, but a series of cycles, daily, seasonal, generational, that turned with a reassuring, predictable cadence. This repetition was not monotony, but a form of stability, a known path through an otherwise perilous world. The day itself had a clear, unvarying pattern. It was framed by light, rising with the sun, working while it shone, retreating to the hearth as it faded. The canonical hours, even for those not in a monastery, loosely structured time. Prime for morning work, sext for the midday meal, vespers as the light failed. The week pivoted on Sunday, a day of enforced rest and communal worship. The year was the grandest cycle of all. The great agricultural wheel of plowing, sowing, tending, and harvesting that dictated every action and every worry. These rhythms were reinforced by ritual. The same hymns were sung on the same feast days each year. The same processions wound through the fields at Rogatiantide to bless the crops. The same stories were told by the fire in the deep of winter. The same tasks were performed in the same order. Churning butter on Thursday, baking bread on Saturday, mending nets on a rainy afternoon. This created a world that was deeply knowable. A person knew what they would likely be doing next Tuesday, next October, next year. In a life where death could come suddenly and disaster inexplicably, this predictability was a sanctuary. It bred a quiet resilience. There was comfort in knowing that however bad the harvest, spring would come again and the fields would need planting. However deep the winter, the feast of Christmas would arrive with its familiar customs. The rhythms were a promise of continuity, a testament that life, in its essential pat. Chapter 47. The Medieval Night. A truly different darkness. When the last ember of the hearth was banked and the final rushlight sputtered into a curl of smoke, a transformation occurred that modern people can scarcely comprehend. The medieval night descended, not as a dimming of light, but as an absolute visceral presence. This was a darkness untouched by street lamp or electronic glow, a profound blackness that filled the world from the ground to the sky, broken only by the stars and, if she was risen, the moon. It was a different country with different rules. Within the home, the dark was a close, intimate thing. In the single-room cottage, it was a blanket that settled over the sleepers, so complete that you could not see your own hand before your face. Sounds became amplified. The rustle of straw as someone turned, the slow breath of a child, the scuttle of a mouse in the thatch, the wind sighing at the door. The dark was not empty. It was full of these small, close whispers. It was a time of deep, unbroken rest for the weary body, but also a time when the imagination, untethered by sight, could wander into uneasy territory. Outside, the dark was absolute and potentially hostile. To travel was an act of courage or desperation. Paths vanished. Familiar landmarks were swallowed. The world of day, the friendly oak, the neighbor's fence, became a potential hiding place for threat. This was the realm of the outlaw, the wolf, and the things of story. The curfew law, requiring all hearth fires to be covered or extinguished, was as much about preventing crime under this cloak of invisibility as it was about preventing conflagration. Yet, this profound darkness also framed the celestial with a brilliance we have lost. The Milky Way was a vast, luminous river. Constellations were not just pictures but vital guides. The moon's phases were a crucial calendar. The night sky was an active, watched, and wondrous text. The medieval night was, therefore, a paradox, a time of V. Chapter 48. Drifting Back from the Past. Our quiet journey through the unwashed centuries, through the smoke of the hall and the rhythm of the field, now draws to a close. We have lingered in a world that operated on a different frequency, where time was measured in seasons and prayers, where light was a precious commodity to be hoarded, and where the scent of wood smoke and earth was the very air of life. It was a world of profound contrasts, of glorious cathedral spires piercing the sky above muddy, tumultuous streets, of elaborate codes of chivalry masking the raw realities of power and survival, of deep community bonds forged in the crucible of shared hardship. We have seen the quiet logic in their fear of water, the ingenious system of layered linen, the slow, patient turning of the agricultural wheel that governed all. We have heard the sounds of that world, the tap of the blacksmith's hammer at dusk, the groan of the mill's great wheel, the watchman's call in the fog, the scratch of a quill in a silent scriptorium. We have felt the texture of its life, the chill of the single-room cottage, the warmth of the communal hearth, the ache of unending labor, and the brief, bright release of the Saints' Day fair. This was not a simpler time, but a deeply complex one operating on principles that can seem foreign to us now. Its comforts were not in convenience, but in the deep, resilient grooves of custom and repetition. Its hardships were intimate and ever-present. As we drift back from this distant shore, we leave behind the smell of baking bread from the communal oven, the sight of a rushlight's tiny, defiant flame, and the sound of a village settling into the utter silence of a moonless night. We return to our own world, perhaps seeing its light, its speed, and its cleanliness with slightly different eyes, carrying with us the echo of a slower, darker, smellier, and profoundly human past. The medieval world recedes, not as a fairy tale, but as a lived reality, a Chapter 49. The Echo in the Stone. There is a silence that is not empty, but full. It is the silence that settles in a place long after the bustle has faded, when the echoes of footsteps have been absorbed by dust and time. We find it now, not in the living village or the smoky hall, but in their remains. In the stumbled-upon foundation of a cottage, a mere rectangle of mossy stones in a sheep field. In the broken arch of a monastery wall, standing alone in a quiet meadow. In the ridge and furrow lines of a medieval field, still visible from the air, like the corduroy of a giant's trousers. These are the places where our journey truly settles. The wood has rotted, the thatch has dissolved, the voices have vanished. But the stone endures, and the shaped earth remembers. To walk these sites is to hear history not as a story, but as a whisper in the gaps. The imagination must do the work of filling in the warmth, the smell, the chatter. Here, where the altar stood, the mass was sung. There, where the hearthstone lies cold, a family huddled against a winter's night. This sunken lane was worn down by 1,000 carts and 10,000 trudging feet. This is the final lesson of the medieval world, its deep integration with the land. They built not for the ages in a grand, abstract sense, but for need from the materials at hand. Their legacy is not a frozen monument, but a subtle fingerprint on the landscape. A hedge line that is older than the oldest tree. A parish boundary that follows a Saxon track. A village name that holds, fossilized within it, the name of the man who first cleared the wood. Our modern world is built atop theirs, often literally. But in forgotten corners, in the green quiet of the countryside, their shadow remains. It is a gentle, patient presence. It asks for no admiration, only a moment of recognition. To see it is to understand that the past is not a separate country. It is the ground we walk on. The unwashed centuries have settled into the soil. Chapter 50. The Last Light, a return to the hearth. And so we circle back, as all things do, to where we began, to the light against the dark, to the small, defended warmth. We have wandered the breadth of this age, from the king's court to the peasant's cot, through forest and field, cathedral and cloister. We have seen its grandeur and its grime, its brutal toil and its delicate dreams. Now, at the end, let the vast tapestry shrink once more to a single, simple point of focus. Imagine the last light in the village. Not the watchman's lantern, nor the cold gleam of the moon on the mill pond, but the light from a single, small window. It is the faint, orange glow of a banked hearth fire seen through a pane of horn or a shutter's crack. It is not bright. It does not push the night far back. But it holds. Behind that light, all the themes of an age coalesce. There is the labor. The wool being spun for tomorrow's work. The tool handle being smoothed by a calloused hand. There is the faith. A simple wooden cross on the wall. A muttered prayer for protection through the hours of darkness. There is the smell of dried herbs from the rafters, of yesterday's bread, of the packed earth floor. There is the quiet breath of sleepers, the weight of a shared life in a single room. This is the core. Before the castles and the chronicles, before the wars and the treaties, this was the unit. The household gathered around its source of warmth and safety. Everything else, the manor, the church, the kingdom, was a widening ripple from this stone. The lord in his hall sought to replicate it on a grand scale. The monk in his cell sought to replace its physical warmth with a spiritual one. But here, in its simplest form, was the engine of survival and the repository of love. Watch that light. See how small it is in the immense, breathing dark. See how brave. Fights nothing. Proclaims nothing. Simply is. A statement of presence. A claim that here, in this spot, life persists.